We've looked at the structure of life, the basic building blocks from which it's constructed. Now let's go a little higher up the hierarchy and look at the structures that are formed from these molecules. So here are our friends again, these creatures that we're familiar with at the large scale. What happens if we take them and we look at them under the microscope? Well, one of the first things that we notice is that they're made up of cells. And this is an image of some skin cells, essentially packages of reactions and molecules that form cellular structures. Cellular structures can be something of a few microns size, a few thousandths of a millimeter in diameter. And cells are quite complex. If you break them apart, you'll find many functions within a cell that are responsible for allowing life to do its various chemical reactions. But in essence, there are three major features of cells that we're going to look at here that are important from an astrobiological point of view, in the sense that these are the things that define how these cells function, how they make up life. First of all, there's a membrane to enclose all those chemical reactions. If you didn't have a membrane, you would simply dissipate into the environment. All of those macromolecules, or those large molecules that we saw earlier, would just disperse into the environment. So cells essentially have a membrane to enclose the biochemical reactions. They also need an information storage system. We've seen that that's deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, in order to encode the instructions that the organism needs to keep up its cells, to grow cells, and to reproduce. And that information storage system also transmits information from one generation to another. So cells must have within them a coding structure, an information storage system. And they must also have a system for gaining energy. Where are they going to get the energy to do all those chemical reactions in building up those building blocks that we saw earlier? And how are those cells going to reproduce? Well, they need energy to do that. So within each cell, there must be an apparatus to make energy. So a membrane, an information storage system, and an energy producing system are basic to all cells on Earth. If you look at a mammal cell, you can see here, it's very, very complex. It includes all sorts of organelles. These are other small structures inside the cell that do other things important for communication, for example, between different mammal cells, and for encoding other instructions that allow the cell to move around and do other complex patterns of behavior. But even if you look at a complex cell like this from a mammal, you'll find that it still has those three basic units, those three basic ingredients that it needs in order to be able to function. A membrane to enclose everything, the information storage system in DNA, and a method for gathering energy. Let's have a look at those three structures and think about them in more detail and why they're important for making life work. First of all, let's look at the membrane. The cell membrane is made up of compounds called lipids. We saw earlier how these are building blocks, structures, complex molecules that make up life. Lipids are another type of complex molecule. They're very ingenious because some of these lipids have, as you can see here, a head that's attracted to water and a long tail that doesn't like water, and that tail wants to get away from water. If you take these molecules and you put them in water and you mix them up, those tails spontaneously are attracted towards each other because they're trying to get away from the water, but the heads are attracted towards the water. And as you can see here, what you get formed is essentially what's called a bilipid membrane layer. It's a layer of these molecules that spontaneously forms a membrane in water. And that layer of molecules can form vesicles, spherical structures or near spherical structures that can enclose material inside. So a cell membrane is made up of these phospholipids, these lipid molecules that spontaneously arrange in liquid water. Automatically they arrange together to form these vesicles, these membranous structures that can enclose things within them. Once we've formed a membrane in this way, we then have to form an information storage system, and this is made up of DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid. Let's have a little bit of a look at this molecule and see how it works, see how it functions in its role both as an information storage system but also in transmitting information from one generation to another. DNA has a backbone, as you can see in this double helix, and between this double helix are what we call base pairs. And these base pairs are made up of 4 different molecules. Adenine, that we'll call A, thymine, that we'll call T, cytosine, that we call C, and guanine, that we call G. These are the 4 letters of an alphabet, if you like, a code that instructs the cell on how to make particular molecules. For example, in one cell, if we were to string those particular molecules together, it might read something like AAT, CG, and that might mean build this particular molecule responsible for eye colour. Another piece of DNA might have a different sequence of these letters, GGCAGAT, and maybe that means construct a molecule that's responsible for helping to build bones, and so on and so forth. By stringing these 4 letters together in different combinations, we can create codes of long strings of letters that tell the cell to do particular things. It's a really ingenious code. And particular codes, discrete codes, are called genes. And genes are a set of instructions that tell the cell to produce a particular protein or a particular molecule. So DNA is a molecule in which these 4 smaller molecules, A, T, C, and G, are strung together in a long code and provide the information storage for that cell in order to be able to do its housekeeping functions and make new types of molecules. So you might then wonder, well, okay, that explains how DNA acts as an information storage system. We can see how this molecule can use these 4 letters to create long, ingenious codes for producing particular molecules. But how does it replicate from one generation to another? Well, DNA has another very intriguing and ingenious trick up its sleeve. These 4 letters that we've just spoken about, A, T, G, and C, can only bind to each other in particular combinations. A can only bind to T, and C can only bind to G. And they bind together to form these base pairs, and you can see a diagram here of base pairs of a long string of these letters on the left-hand side, and the complementary bases on the other side. So where we've got a C attached to it, we have a G, and where there's a T, there's an A, and vice versa. And so throughout the center of DNA, there are these base pairs of TA and G and C bound together through the center of the molecule. Let's have a look at what happens if we pull those base pairs apart, if we split the DNA double helix in 2. Well, if we split the double helix in 2, we end up with 2 single strands. And along one strand, we've got that code that we've just talked about, and on the other strand, we've got the complementary code, those letters that previously bound to the other strand. Well, we've just said that G can only bind to C. So if there's a G in that single strand of DNA, the cell knows that it has to bind a C back onto that G. And next to a T, it has to bind an A, and so on and so forth. So if we split the 2 single strands apart, we can immediately synthesize a complementary strand on both of those new strands that are now single strands. And that way, we can generate 2 new double helices, which you can see here depicted in this diagram. So the DNA double helix is split in 2. We've ended up with 2 single strands, and then the DNA knows from that code which of those 4 letters it must bind to the letters already there in the single strand. And once it's done that, it can resynthesize 2 strands of DNA. And this is the way in which DNA replicates information from one generation to another, faithfully replicating information from one cell to another as it divides. And this is how cells divide. And here's a diagram of a bacterium dividing, and the DNA is splitting in 2, the double helix is splitting into single strands that are being used to resynthesize double strands, and as a result, 2 cells can form from 1. This is the basis of DNA replication and cell division. It's what allows our cells to grow, and it's what allows organisms to grow from puppies to large dogs, as we saw earlier in the course. So we can see now very simply how we can enclose information in a membrane and make a cell, how we can use DNA, a very ingenious molecule, to instruct the cell to produce new molecules, and how it can divide. What about energy? All cells need energy to grow and to reproduce, and to get that energy to divide DNA in the first place. All cells contain systems for gathering energy, and there are different types of energy systems. Here are just 3 of them to give you some idea. You and I, we're called heterotrophs, and that means we get our carbon from organic carbon like steak or other types of meat, organic molecules made of carbon. There are other types of organisms in the biosphere, which we'll come across throughout this course, that use different methods of getting energy. For example, the phototrophs, like trees, that gather their energy from sunlight, photosynthetic organisms. These are called phototrophs, literally eating sunlight. And then there are organisms called chemolithotrophs, which literally means chemical rock eater, or chemical element eater. These are creatures that can get their energy by eating rocks, and these are confined to the microorganisms. These are literally bacteria, for example, that get their energy by consuming iron in rocks, and these turn out to be very interesting for astrobiology, because the chemolithotrophs live in very extreme environments, like volcanic environments, and deep in the crust of the Earth, where there's no organic material to feed them like you and I need, and there's no sunlight, so they can't do photosynthesis. Instead, they live off the energy from rocks. These chemolithotrophs are the sorts of organisms we might look for deep in the crust of other planetary bodies such as Mars. So these are just 3 examples of energy gathering. Photosynthesis from light, heterotrophy by eating organic molecules, including you and I, and chemolithotrophs, microorganisms that get their energy from rocks. This is a diagram of the energy gathering apparatus in cells. We don't need to worry about this, but I wanted to show you it because you can see it's actually very, very complex. The biochemical machinery to gather energy from the environment has an enormous number of molecules involved in it. But at the end of the day, if you strip away all that complex biochemistry, it's very, very simple. It's all about extracting energy from atoms and molecules in the environment to provide the energy for cell replication and cell growth. And you can understand that getting energy from rocks might be biochemically a complex thing for a cell to do, but at the end of the day it's using some pretty simple materials, the elements within rocks that you and I might find outside in our garden. So life looks very diverse and it looks very unrelated. And when you look at it at a large scale, particularly the sorts of organisms that you can see with the naked eye, such as these ones here, it may look like that diversity makes life very complex to understand, and indeed life is very complex. But at its core, it's very, very simple. And what we've seen in this lecture is that the cellular structures from which life is made, the cellular structures built up from those building blocks that we saw in an earlier lecture, are actually common to all life on Earth. Energy gathering, cellular membranes to enclose the biochemical reactions, the biology of life, and an information storage system, DNA, used by life on Earth to transmit information from one generation to another and to encode instructions in the cell. What have we learned then in this lecture? We've learned that life is made of cells. We've learned that cells have some basic features: a membrane, information storage system, and the ability to gather energy, although depending upon the type of cell, it may also have many other organelles and complex structures. But these are the 3 basic building blocks of cells. And we've learned that all life on Earth has these characteristics. In other words, all life on Earth has some very simple systems from which the cells are made and which have been the case since the origin of life on the Earth.